February with this one. So, all right. So we are here, here with Jake and Steve, and we are doing Caste by Isabel. Is it Isabel? Yeah, Isabel Wilkerson. Both Jake and Steve have been on the show before, and so I'm happy to have them back. Caste is called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. Has either of you fellows read her other book?
No. Ashamed to say no.
It's it was always on my list, the Warmth of Other Suns. It's about the Great Migration. And it's supposed to be phenomenal, but I never had got to it. And then this one obviously came out like boom, everybody's reading it. So I jumped on this one first. So thank you fellas for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to read the inside cover just to give people a little. No, I won't read it all because I'm going to cough a lot, but I'll just give a real quick. In this brilliant book, Isabel Wilkerson gives us a masterful portrait of an unseen phenomenon in America as she explores through an immense, deeply researched narrative and stories about real people, how America today and throughout its history has been shaped by a hidden caste system, a rigid hierarchy of human beings, of human rankings. I'll tell you, and I want to say this too right off the bat, if I had to pick 5 of my most important books I ever read, not best books, but most, I'd say, influential on my life, that really opened up and changed my way of thinking, this would be on my top 5. So I want you, while we're talking at the end, I want to ask both of you for your top 5 most influential books on your lives. So just be thinking. All right. So what from this book, what points, stories, whatever, let's just start out with that. What stands with you? I'll start with you, Jake. What stood out with this book to you? When you think about this book, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's jam-packed with like a lot of history, right? I mean, there's this overarching theme of caste as kind of this hidden social mechanism that we haven't considered, rather than class, that really explains the racial disparity issue in the United States. But I think for me, I mean, there's a lot of knowledge about the Reconstruction era that's kind of smattered throughout the book that I had no idea about. I mean, I paid attention to history class. I considered myself a history geek. And, I didn't know what all happened right after the Civil War. And I think, she does a good job of explaining that, but then also just tying into what are the repercussions and what have happened, here in the US since. So if I had to like pick one thing that kind of surprised me too, it would be maybe like the 1950s in Cincinnati. I don't know if you guys saw that part, but, here's this issue in the 1950s, the city that we're all living in, where the swimming pools are getting integrated, and here the white people on the sidelines are throwing in glass, they're throwing nails in swimming pools. And I think that kind of sets the tone of what kind of actions have happened in the past that could actually happen again in the future. And
sure,
I think this is like the broader zeitgeist of, going into a new administration here and a new politic. But I think kind of those things in combination are kind of what really hit me with this book.
And to speak on your Reconstruction, the reason you don't remember it is because it's really not taught. It's a shame that Reconstruction for Ohio schools, it's the focus, you take it in 8th grade, and the focus really is the Civil War. And then you're supposed to learn about Reconstruction right after that before you go to high school. And the problem is, number one, most teachers so interested in the Civil War, all the attention there. Then they just say, and then Reconstruction happened in the year. Essentially, that's where they end the year. They might spend a day or a couple, 2 or 3 on it, and they're 8th graders, right? And the teachers, obviously, the way even I was raised growing up too, I didn't learn a lot about it. So as a teacher, when I taught 8th grade, it wasn't something very interesting. It didn't seem interesting. You know what I mean? This is it just snowballs or it's just a cycle of people not really caring about that era because it seems uninteresting. But man, like you said, it is very crazy interesting. But the problem is you don't touch it in high school. And then you may be lucky to get it in college, but honestly, most people don't. So yeah, it falls through the cracks. Yeah. Steve, what about you? What stood out to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would just jump off what Jake said there. That part of it is just realizing how much you're not taught in school. Like I'm a 50-year-old man reading that book, and just so much of it, you're realizing that you only had maybe a cursory knowledge of, or you hadn't really thought a lot about. Like you said, we learn about the Civil War, and then we learn about the Civil Rights Movement,
Yep.
and then it's kind of like, and then things got better, sort of an attitude, and there really isn't a discussion about. I even just started asking my own son, like, what do you think happened after the Civil War? Like, it's just kind of interesting to think you have 4 million slaves that are suddenly not slaves. Well, but they also have no jobs and no resources. Like, and even I think most adults don't know that story of exactly what occurs in those years after that. So I think it was just being shocked by, how much we've kind of missed out in our education that we need to kind of maybe go back and spend a little time on, because it's a painful part of our nation's history, and something that's shameful, to be straight with it. And people do not like to dwell on the shame and realizing that these things aren't that far away. One of the things that stuck out to me in the book was how they talked about how these miscegenation laws, these laws against intermarriage, those weren't taken off the books until maybe 1967. I think that was the last of them. They said 41 states had laws against it. And then they talked about, there was a line too where they said by 1970, most white people in the South had never even really shook the hand of a black person.
Crazy.
That's kind of wild, right? Like, that's
It's
kind
wild.
of a. So I think it was a lot of and then some of the questions we were maybe going to be talking about as we move on here. But so I don't want to go too much into it, but just to say the influence that American writers and American laws and politics had on the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
Was also something that stood out.
Into that. Well, that's the thing too. You know, when I teach the Nuremberg laws this year, I teach freshman American history or world history. One of the things is, excuse me, these kids learn that Jews cannot intermarry with the rest of society, and that just seems like crazy, And it's like, well, to take a step back and say, well, they got these ideas from American laws. They looked at us as the example, and it wasn't like just a casual look. they studied it, right?
Right. And they thought we went too far.
They kind of said, "Hey, how does America really take this other group of people and say, how do you truly make them feel inferior, or how do you truly make them feel not a part of society?" And looked at us as the example, which, you hate to say it, as somebody that teaches this, and you kind of just miss that, and you're just like, wow, how do I miss that? It's frustrating. And I think that's the biggest thing I learned from the book was somebody that, and I know you both too, you've read books on race and the problems in our country and systematic racism and how this all works. And yet when she introduced the idea of caste, race is the skin, but caste is the bones. I'd never noticed it. I mean, you notice it a little bit, but not like this. You don't realize that the real problem, race is here. Caste is what creates all of our issues, really, that's going on. And for somebody that's been interested in this subject to say that, wow, I didn't even I didn't recognize that was eye-opening. I think that's why it's one of my top 5 books. It has to be.
I think framing this in terms of caste was a super smart move on her part,
right?
Because partially because and she kind of talks about too, like the word racism is a loaded word. It's also I feel like it's a language problem that we have this term that's essentially applied to everything from touching someone's hair unwantedly, from wanting to hang them from a tree.
Right.
It's almost like, it's like too broad of a term, a loaded word, where caste really gets to the nuts and bolts of what's going on. And I like how she makes that distinction between how, if I'm understanding her right, I think she's saying that every racist is a casteist, but not necessarily every casteist is a racist, in that when you think of racism, you think of people that just hate other people, and they have a philosophy towards their hate. Like, I believe this, I have this white supremacy belief, where caste is more of a unspoken, this is the way things are. And you are making a fertile ground for racism to continue, even though there really isn't necessarily exactly hate in your heart. It's just I believe this is the order of things,
Yeah. Jake, you have anything to add?
I mean, it's exactly what she says, right? It's deeply ingrained in the American consciousness. It's not something that people choose to do. It's something that they're born into. It's a system, just like other cultural processes, whether it's the mores that we have on how we even shake each other's hands, whether white or black or not. But beyond that, I mean, it's within the fabric. So it's the habitus. It's what goes on and what dictates that social kind of fabric behind the scenes. And I think
this is the problem when you hear about, you have these woke people, that I try to be woke, and and when black people speak out, like, you may be woke, you may be trying your best, but you're still not there. And I think this is what they mean by that. And because we are a part of this caste system that is not imaginary. If that's one thing from the book is, once you realize it exists, there's no way around it. It frames everything that you see now. It's kind of like, Plato's cave. Now you're enlightened, and you're going to look at everything different. And I really do look at myself before the book and the examples that she gave, and not, just things that are embedded in the back of your mind because of growing up in this system. Even if you are trying, like, anti-racist, some of these things exist in all of our heads because it is everything around us. It is the the fabric of what existed in this country, like she said, before we even became a country. And for people that are watching, let me just give an example of what she describes as caste. Well, first of all, she says, compared to the Indian caste system, but she says caste is an arbitrary ranking of human value in society. It determines the standing, the respect, the benefit of doubt or the lack thereof, the access to resources of the lack thereof, and the assumptions of competence and beauty in a system. It is a hierarchy based on perceived value, and we see this perceived value is everywhere in society. It's automatically whether this person matters more or matters less.
She talks a bit about hypodescent too. I don't think she uses that word, but it's something social scientists use to describe this one drop rule, right? And so we go back to the example of the Nazis using the US as kind of their drawing board to decide upon how to build their eugenic based philosophy and laws, right? And they say that the US went a little too far. So I think it was 1/16 Jewish was what counted you as Jewish in the Nazi regime. In the US, there really is no bottom to that. Give you 1/32.
Like you said, a drop. It's crazy. I have a poster that I've not put up yet in my room. And at first I got it from the Gilder Lehman Institute just a couple months ago. And there's a white girl and a black girl there. And it says something about slavery. And I'm looking at it like, this is an odd poster. And then at the bottom, it's about the one drop rule. It's just crazy. Like, I'm looking at a white girl and a black boy sitting there. And no, she's considered black because of that one drop rule. And again, that opened my eyes too. And like you said, the Nazis said we took it too far.
Put things in perspective, yeah.
Yeah, and it's true, right? All right, so let's say in the beginning, she compares American racial hierarchy or caste to a dormant virus. Is this a good metaphor? Do you guys think? How does this help combat the myth that racism is dead in America? For instance, racism is dead in America. I had conversations with friends this summer when all, when we were lighting up with riots, they called them, or protests. And, they would tell me, America, racism is dead except for you people that are bringing it up. We had a black president, Barack Obama. As long as you want to rise up in society, you can. So she gives this idea of this dormant virus to help combat the myth that is that racism is dead. What do you guys think of that? We'll start with Jake this time, or Steve this time. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
Go, Steve.
Well, I just think that that there is a growing recognition that this has been seething beneath the surface. I remember when people would talk, when Obama was elected, I did a lot of traveling in Europe, and there would be a lot of, wow, this is great that that you elected, a black man was elected. We thought that America had problems with race and things. And even back then I was telling them it took a perfect storm for Obama to get elected. His charisma and all of his great attributes against the just complete, debacle that was the GOP and their candidates both times, to create that situation. And I think it created a little bit of a false sense that we were further along than we really were. And then obviously for 8 years, a lot of America sat seething in that situation. And then, it all percolated to the surface with our most recent president, and brought it to the surface. And it was just kind of shocking to watch, because I just feel like a lot of people that live in either are already kind of separate. They're not really in very diverse neighborhoods to begin with, or they're not in groups of people that are openly racist or anything. I think that they can sometimes be in a bubble where they're, as white people, in a bubble of not recognizing how many people have these feelings, and it's, Jake had mentioned the pool in the 50s in Cincinnati. I remember it was 2012 when there was a landlord here in Cincinnati who put up a whites only sign on the pool at a duplex. That was 2012. And then I remember reading about, in the South, there were segregated proms going on. Somebody will have to check me, but I think they were past 2010.
Mm-hmm.
That they were holding segregated proms. Yeah. And I don't think most people even knew that was occurring. Like, it was not something that was really talked about.
Right.
So you're just hoping that books like this lead to, there just obviously needs to be way more conversation about, where we've been and where we're at.
Right. One of the things too, books like this, I think, is, we're doing our best as white people. We have to be a part of this. We can't lead the effort or whatever, but we're, I don't know what percent of the population. We have to change our mindset, or, this isn't just about black people fighting for their rights, and they're doing it and rising up in a vacuum, right? We need people like us that are breaking out of this mental system that we've grown up in and around. And what kind of scares me, and what you said is people learn, what kind of scares me at the same time is I look at all these people that aren't trying, that don't care. But then I look at myself before I read this book and even realize, man, I even was missing something that's in front of our faces. That honestly, if you sit down and talk to a lot of black people, none of this caste system is probably common knowledge and common sense. Maybe not the word or the phrases she uses, but this setup of like, of course, and so that kind of, I don't know if it frightens me or makes me pessimistic more, but even people that are trying to learn weren't there yet. Jake, what's your take on this? Her idea of this being a dormant virus.
I mean,
that's a metaphor.
No doubt about it, right? I mean, the idea that's anything with the social fabric that's going to elicit a response. So you got this age of Karens, for lack of a better word, right? These women calling police on people who are just living their lives And I mean, that right there doesn't mean that this person is intentionally racist, but they're responding to the types of emotions that this dormant virus, which is this casteism or American form of racism, that's eliciting in them. I take a step back. I mean, you know, I think we need to acknowledge we're three white dudes talking about race. I think it's very good that we're talking about this. These are the types of discussions that need to be had. We need to be called out when we're making, you know, faux pas on it. But I mean, I think that's the first part, right? Is us admitting that there are blind spots. I think that many people who say, I don't care if you're purple, black, brown, yellow, it comes from a good place, but I mean, that's casteism within it. Nobody who's purple exists. So, you know, it's a bit disingenuous to people that have real life experiences. And, you know, I think that's the first part of this book to recognize is there are blind spots, and it's not our fault there are these blind spots, but it is our responsibility to go ahead and kind of undo that ignorance that's there.
You know, you made me empathize with those people now, because usually those people that say, I don't see color, it just fires me up. But you know what? You're right. They are coming from probably in their mind a good space, and they're just not along the road. And maybe that's it. You know, but whether they're walking on or not is the problem.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people aren't looking to further themselves, to learn more, and that's the big issue, I guess. And I don't know how we're going to get there. That's one of my last questions.
Mean, you use the term, and I think the author uses it too, is the empathy, right? But it's not just empathy; it's radical empathy.
Right.
This idea of, you know, getting past feeling the plight of others, or at least acknowledging that they have a basic human right to understand where they come from, but not just understand where they come from, but understand that their background and experiences have led them to a different place than you. And, you know, that's really the key on getting to that next level and kind of undoing that virus. And I mean, it's the same thing, right? Like, first we need to acknowledge science, just like we are with COVID right now. We need to acknowledge that science, it works. So like, we have these vaccines, we can fight the COVID virus, but likewise, we can fight this racial issue with science as well. And I mean, it's acknowledging race does not exist, never did. We've known that since at least the 1920s, the latest, that scientifically racism does not even make sense.
Right.
So if we can start there, that racial categorization does not even work. That, you know, I with Mediterranean background, at least on some side, has more relation with somebody who's from Ethiopia because of Semitic migrations or whatever, than that person from Ethiopia has maybe with somebody from Nigeria. I mean, if we just acknowledge that from the get-go, then that just undoes all of the structure.
You know, but that's hard to do. You know, if I went to some people I know right now, if I said race does not exist, you know, and I had to read about that really to understand it, because it is so ingrained in us, you know, and I grew up in a family that was pretty open, not racist, you know. Of course, they were as racist as society was. So I don't want to say they weren't racist, but not outwardly racist. And still, just, I guess one of the things that's just how ingrained all this is in each of our brains, just from everything around us, it is crazy. But how do you know, I guess one of the things is, I'm just looking at, if I were to go to talk to somebody and say race is a construct, just like gender, right? These people just don't want to hear it. You know, that learning process stops kind of there. And I don't know what the answer is there.
I want to jump back to what Jake said about the Karens calling cops. You know, those examples are another reason why the word caste is so effective rather than like racism. Because I think those people, like that woman that called the cops on the black birder in the park, I'm sure that she doesn't think she's a racist. You know, right. She thinks, I have no hatred towards this guy, but he has stepped out of his expectations, right? He's pushed back against caste. He's you know, he's in an environment and he's doing this act of birding that she doesn't associate with black people. Right. But it is more of a pushing up against expectations and just the order of things that you often find white people responding to, and framing it in terms of caste might just be so much more effective, because I think a lot of these people they really struggle to recognize their racism because they don't think they have hatred in their hearts, and sometimes they don't actually have hatred in their heart. But what they're doing is still hurtful. you know.
Like
And-
the lady that went over to the father that was eating with his son and telling him, you know, I just need you to finish your juice. And the white lady felt like she went over and stuck up for the son, like, you don't have to drink your juice. Dad's like, what?
I don't know you. What are you doing? Get out of here.
Right. And the sad thing is I could see that happening. And would she ever do that to another white person? You know? And that's like
we know the answer to that.
Caste isn't. I think you're right. It helps me understand it a lot more, and I think it'll help society if enough people can grasp that new idea that you're not. You don't think you're doing it because you hate black people. You're doing it because this guy is at a hierarchy in our society that maybe he doesn't know how to raise a child correctly. And so I do, and I'm going to, step in so he doesn't mess this up, right? Competency. That's one of the things she said that is big in a hierarchy is how you perceive someone's competency. And so obviously she perceived his competency as a father as low, and so she had to step in.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too different from the Wilkinson gives an example of in India. There's this, or I think maybe it was in the UK, but it was another Indian. There's this presentation that happens, and there's somebody from a higher caste that comes and gives a recommendation of what should have been included in the presentation. The person says, I have no idea who this person is. I don't think they're even in the field, and yet they thought it was their right of this competency just because of their place of birth to give that advice.
Right, and wasn't it a racial discussion? Was it a discussion on race? What was the discussion on?
I can't recall. I think it was something to do with at least castes. I think
it was a discussion on caste. And the head of it, right? Yeah, that's right. It was totally hypocritical and amazing. I wrote divide and conquer here. And it's just something that, you see a lot in that in our caste system, in our hierarchy, that they put, obviously they say the black is lowest, but in our lowest class system, you have poorer whites, right? And so our society seems to, or at least society likes to push that competition or that maybe hatred. I don't know if that's too strong of a word. Divide and conquer. She doesn't get into it a lot in the book. Well, she does. She mentioned stories. I don't know what term she uses, but I thought maybe we should discuss that because you see a lot of this pushing casteism. I don't know if that's the word, by lower whites, poverty-stricken whites, people at the lower ranks of class, not caste, pushing against the lower ranks of the caste system so they could keep themselves up one. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, and she does have that. Wilkerson does have that line in the book where she talks about who was that? I can't remember who it was. Was it a politician who had said the highest black should not be above the lowest white?
Right. I forgot about that.
It was just this idea of I've got this little bit of social comfort that I know at least I'm always better than this other group of people.
Right.
It's just all this ridiculous in-group, out-group, trying to, people in low socioeconomic situations trying to scapegoat other people for
scapegoat, right? That was a good chapter too, right? About
scapegoating is a big part of it. But she also talks about how, class is something that you can act your way out of. You can behave your way out of it. And caste is something that you are forever trapped in. If you're an untouchable, you're an untouchable.
Right. So no matter what, if the black guy can somehow get an education and get a great job and can speak, it's one thing she said with dialect too, speak different. His class can rise. But as far as most people would look at, you're still in that same lower caste. Right. Yeah, I thought that was a good way to, because I at first didn't understand the difference either. And honestly, when I teach and I talk about classes and castes, I honestly use that word almost interchangeably because I didn't recognize the difference, which was my bad. One thing I want to add to that, Stephen, you made me think of this when you were talking. Reconstruction didn't work because of caste. And I just really, I think what happened, you had these radical Republicans go down, and I think many of them meant well. and Black society now got to be elected to representative government. Many, I mean, the amount of in Congress was like more than we have now, right? The numbers, elected officials, the amount of Black businesses, all these things during Reconstruction, the first few years were at an all-time high for our country. And then for some reason, our federal government folded, did a deal with the devil, and all that collapses, and I think the first time I'm really thinking about it now, when we learned about Reconstruction and this and that, but they couldn't let that happen. And it wasn't racist ideas. It was, I mean, obviously it was, but caste had everything to do with that. Is you wanted to say, okay, you're rising out of where you're supposed to be.
I think the point that it illustrates too with that is, it was the former slave owners and the whites in the South that got the reparations. It wasn't the Black community. And I mean, reparations, that's been such a national conversation for, I mean, if you look in any history book, forever, right? I think just finally we're seeing even some cities and locales thinking to do it. Before I moved back to Cincinnati, there's a neighborhood, or I guess small town just north of where I was living, Evanston, Illinois. And they just started an experiment to pay out reparations to the Black community. But that's not even something that's happening. It didn't happen in Reconstruction. And I mean, of course, you need to acknowledge the disadvantage.
Did have either of you read Coates is the Case for Reparations? No, I've been meaning to too. I should probably read that next. But yeah, that's one of those things where honestly, in my old mind, because I think, Steve, you grew up similar to me. I think, Jake, have you always been a little to the left? Have you grown up a little bit?
A little bit more than a little, but yeah. I mean, I grew up on the west side, surrounded not so much by the left, but I was very left ever since.
See, Steve and I think are in the same boat, right, Steve? Where we grew up pretty much in the right and then made our adjustment in our mid to late 20s. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, both my parents were raised a Republican. My mom's an evangelical, but my father and my mother too. Like, my mother voted for Trump in 2016, and she deeply loathes him now. my father didn't vote for him in either election, and I think that he's been on a slow path to where I'm at too. I just never, I just took everything for granted, so to speak. Like, I just wasn't overly political. I didn't think much about things into my mid 20s. And then, the more I started researching into it, the more I kind of pulled away from what I was falling into just by nature of birth.
Yeah, and I was with you. So when you say the word reparations, like Jake did, I need to learn about it, because one of the first things is my kickback. Like I think of just automatically like, well, of course, now where I'm at, of course they deserve it, and we need to figure out a way. But I still feel that natural thing, like it's never going to work. That's not realistic. But it really should be. It should be part of the conversation. I think when I read Coates's, I don't think it's a book, but I think it's a Atlantic article, The Case for Reparations. It'll change my idea. But just feeling that makes me empathize with people that aren't there yet. And I want to go back to this real quick too, is I'm very much into the earth and climate, which I know you both are too. And I'm very much into trying to get society right with this, which is my next question. But the coronavirus and the epidemic we're in, right, pandemic we're in right now, taught me a lot about people. And I've become more pessimistic about change, as far as saying, hey, are people going to wake up and be more radically empathetic Are they going to educate themselves to make a change here for racial equality and caste equality, or get rid of caste, the caste system? But also then, as far as even climate change goes, are people going to make a change, any meaningful change, to not in their own lives? We need to each make a change, but to demand change from our governments and corporations. And to see what we've done with even masks and vaccines, I hate to say it, but I've become more of a pessimist. And I know we're taking a little bit of diversion here, but I want to get each of your ideas on that. As far as making a change, let's frame it towards caste. How do we do it? And do you see it as a realistic outcome? Okay, we'll start with you, Jake.
I've always been of like the mentality of like Rousseau, right? Like people are born with a blank slate and they're corrupted. And I kind of became a bit more of a pessimist during the pandemic as well. But it's not the way that we're here in Cincinnati. It's not how it is everywhere. I mean, I'm going through a bit of my shock right now coming to Cincinnati from Chicago. Like everybody over there, they're wearing masks outside. It's, the exception to see somebody who's running without a mask. And, here it's a bit of a different situation. And, and I don't think it's all politic. I think a lot of it's geographical. I think a lot of it's lifestyle. But I think it's a good parallel for these conversations about changing old habits for the benefit of another person, right? Another population, another subset of population.
And when you can't see the outcome immediately, that's what all these things have to do with, right?
And it's never going to be immediately. It's not. Right. I mean, this is a conversation about long-term thinking without any sort of immediate gratification.
Right.
And the answer is no. Is this caste issue, even if we all acknowledge it today, it's not going to change in the next 40 years. It's going to take 1-2 generations to change that. But that doesn't mean that the work's futile.
No, I think you're right. And I think the problem is too, is one of my biggest things is I want people to, when students that I teach, the one recommendation I say is go away to college. Just get out there. I don't care where, get away from Cincinnati for what. And I love Cincinnati. You move back here. It's home. It's home, but you tend to be here a while, and you start to, you think everybody's like us. Everywhere in the world thinks like we do, and so you got to kind of remember. And I think I'm glad you said that. I remember that. Other people do think different. Steve, what do you think about our chances of changing things for the better?
Well, we've touched on several topics with, caste and racism, and then, you're talking about masks and climate change. And it makes me think of, even back to our conversations about the book, The Swerve. I mean, really what a lot of this comes down to is science. Are people going to live lives guided by reason and empirical evidence, or based on beliefs and feelings? And it's a problem that people don't really want to talk about, because a lot of it has to do with the intertwining of people's religious beliefs with their political beliefs. And Wilkerson talks about that in the book, how, this, that's why it was so big in the South. I mean, the South was a very religious part of our country. And this idea that Black people, have the curse of Ham upon them.
Right.
They have biblical defense of racism, and they have biblical defenses against why they think the climate change isn't real. It's a problem, and we saw how evangelicals were a big part of the resistance to following along with their leaders' wishes in terms of wearing masks and social distancing. And there just needs to be a way to make evident that these are not what people normally associate with Christian values, this complete pushing against normal empathy, and this it's all about me kind of thing and my liberties.
Right.
But that's the big thing. And you can't, good luck talking about that in school too. If you're going to talk about the intertwining of religion and politics, you got a rough, I wouldn't want to, good luck.
Well, no, you brought up a big point, because the two things I think she said is the major things to make this change are radical empathy and education. And I'll tell you, one of my main things I teach modern world issues and world history. Empathy is one of the first words I teach, and putting yourself in their shoes. Not only that, but, trying to get rid of everything you've been taught and understand that if you were born that, you probably make a lot of the same decisions that person would make. If you were born with the same exact situations. That's easier to teach, even though it's very difficult to teach, than the reality of facts. And Steve can understand this as a teacher in a school, and just knowing what. And Jake, not saying you can't, but for me to teach what this book teaches, I don't know. I couldn't get away with it in our present, with the way the world is right now. I could not get away with saying a lot of things that this book says. And if you would ask me 10 years ago, what if this would be the case, I would have said no way. But that is one of the things that holds us back, is if I can't really, two ways that I can't do it. One is because of pushback from parents or maybe administration. But two is it's not put in the curriculum and you're sticking to curriculum. And so to really teach something like this falls nowhere in a high school curriculum, except maybe minority at our school, minority and women's issues. There you go. But I could probably give you the percentage of students that get to that class or take that class. And I would guess in a population as big as ours, I would guess 5%, something very low, So how do you get that word out there when it needs to be one of the most important things out there,
I think you guys' hands are tied, right? Like I went to that school 12 years ago. I know what the demographics like. Sure, it's changed a little bit, but I know what the parents are like. I think right now we have another issue that can be talked about that fits within this caste system, and it's anti-Asian American violence, right?
Yes.
Like that's such a growing topic that fits within this idea of caste, that this middle caste, as the author kind of alludes to, and we see that there's violences. I think it's even like I saw it on Facebook. There's an Asian, I think it's a Chinese restaurant in Clifton that's been like pranked and all this order, and they're losing tons of money because these people are prank calling orders and just not picking it up. But that within this is a broader world issue, and it fits within this caste discussion. I think there's a segue within that.
I've noticed. I'm sorry to jump in, but I noticed as a teacher of high school kids too that they very much see racism as something that happens between white and black people, and not other ethnicities, not other people from other backgrounds. And that's a really interesting thing too, that they just, since it's not something that is talked about or taught about, if they mock or do strange or behave strangely towards a friend of Asian background, they don't think that's the same thing.
Nope.
Which is we're watching any 90s movies, right? I don't think any of us grew up with, if I think when I grew up in the 90s, every movie was racist towards Asians.
Right.
Yeah. You watch any of the Rush Hours, God, those have not aged well at all.
Yeah, or Mexicans. That was recently let's say even Hispanic, because of Central America are coming up. That was almost okayed. The talk in the hallway of the last 10 years, or let's say, I had to bring that to light to many times in my classroom, what I've heard in the hallway or what people would just say, even in class, what they could say outwardly and think that was okay because they were of Latino or Hispanic descent, where they would know if they were saying the same thing about a black person, it would be wrong to say out loud. But like you said, but they don't see the difference of these different groups or speaking outwardly derogatory. It's okay. It was fine. And it blew my mind. That really, I think about 5 years ago was when it was probably at its worst. And you heard it I heard it a lot at school. All right. So we're at the point. Let's see. Anything, let's just take, first of all, final words on the book. Steve, go ahead. What are your final thoughts on the book?
Well, I mean, I would just recommend that people read it. I would say also that it's a pretty quick read. I feel in a lot of ways, like her prose style is really great. You know, I don't think she gets bogged down with things. She has lots of anecdotes that really pull you along and captivate you. Some of it's hard to read. You know, there's going to be some things that are upsetting, but it's a well worthwhile to read it, and you do learn a lot of interesting things that we just did not get an opportunity to learn, unfortunately, in our schooling.
Yeah, and a lot of things that a lot of people just probably didn't realize existed, you know, from our perspective, or knew existed, but never really thought about. Jake, what about you?
I agree completely. I think it's a very accessible book. I think it's something that should be required reading. You know, I think it paints a good picture of something that I've always kind of thought about, which was that, you know, whiteness, it doesn't exist on its own, right? It exists in opposition to blackness, and every other middle caste is one level different or further away from black. And, you know, not every person that's considered white today has always been considered white. I mean, we talk about like, the mass lynchings of, you know, Southern Italians, even in Louisiana, that's mentioned. And, you know, I certainly passed for white today. I wouldn't have passed for white in the 1890s. So I mean, I think these are things that we need to keep in mind as we talk about race. Race is very fluid in some sense, but it's also very stuck in its way. And in order to properly understand it, you need to understand all aspects of it.
Yeah, as you were speaking, you made me remember a book I have, and I just want to see if I have it here. Probably don't. I'm sure I do somewhere. I got my whole Irish section here. It's a book called How the Irish Became White. That's the name of the book. And the Irish came essentially 150 years ago, and the black population has been here essentially since the founding, almost, or not long after, and, you know, able to assimilate and rise up a caste. And the Irish were able to do that quickly, and black population never could. And obviously that's the reason for this. So I asked you guys to think about your 5 most personally influential books. Jake, what are your 5 top?
I've been quite engaged, so I haven't really had time to think, but I'll throw a few out there. So, but I had to throw the first one out.
If you miss one, sorry.
Yeah. Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, talks about the history of money. A lot of misunderstanding about money and how that's really the basis for how people interact, basis of debt. Highly recommend that one. Franz Kafka, The Trial. Always love that book.
Love that.
I think it represents all sorts of disasters that we see in bureaucracy and just things that don't make sense.
We'll talk about that book one day. Okay.
Please. Would love that. Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. Would be 3rd. For Whom the Bells Toll, Ernest Hemingway would be 4th. And then for 5th, it's up for grabs, but I do have to say this book is probably pretty close to that. So we'll go ahead and put Caste for 5th.
I'm glad you mentioned The Trial. I that's that's definitely up there for me. Steve, have you read The Trial?
If I have, it was in undergraduate school, so I'd have to go back.
Just such a, you know, it's one of those books where, again, it looks at society almost like, and I hate to compare it to Caste, but in a way that you never really looked at how it functions. Would you say that, Jake? Would you agree with that a little bit?
Absolutely.
Kind of like, you know, it's like it opens your eyes to society, the bureaucracy of everything, and the control that it has on us mentally, more than anything. It just opens your eyes and you say, wow, how did I not see this before? And so Trial, wow, that's not one of my top 5, but it should be. Steve, what about you?
Okay, yeah, this is a super hard question. Just throw at people, isn't it, Jake?
It is. And if you missed one,
I would also say Caste was a very good book. I mean, when I think of books I would recommend, it probably would make my top 5. And then obviously even some of the ones that you and I have talked about, Mike, like Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve, I think is a super fascinating story about a 14th century papal bureaucrat pulling a poem from antiquity out of the darkness of some monastery and putting it back into circulation, and his thesis that this kind of helped launch the Renaissance is a really interesting idea and a really well written book.
And to jump in on that, Steve, just the thing that really brought to my attention, man, like you said, I'm so glad I read that book. You introduced that to me, was the amount of information that we lost. That he found that is huge, and it swerved us, right? Changed society. But just the amount of information we lost, such as like fires from the Alexandria library, excuse me. But that's what it opened my mind to that is just like the information that's gone forever.
One thing I remember from that book was just the idea that I never knew as an adult that original writing from antiquity, original poems and stuff from antiquity, all come from two places: that library in Herculaneum that had the Villa of the Papyri, and then I think some like garbage heap in Alexandria. Like, that's the only two places on the planet that we have recovered. Everything is a copy of a copy.
And they found up like 1% of it, that they were able to find and be able to read.
So that's a great book, and not a super long book. It's an intense book. I mean, not everybody would love that book, but it's that's a great book. I really love Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted Universe, Science as a Candle in the Darkness. That's a great sort of almost history of science book and its importance. I think that's a really good one. Oh, and then I would love to do a book club sometime on Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. The Moral Landscape is probably the book that I've been most a biggest proselytizer of, because that book is about the false détente between science and religion, really. And this, I'm not going to get in there, because if I start talking about it, I'll start talking about it. But
you recommended that to me, that book, years ago, and I read it. So we'll do a club on that.
That book, The Moral Landscape, is that the name?
Moral Landscape by Sam Harris. It is a fascinating book, and not a very long book.
No.
And also that poor guy, I feel like, is a misunderstood guy in many ways. I mean, maybe I don't know everything, but I think he's, when I say his name, he's such a controversial character. It makes me nervous to begin with. But yeah,
that's what I was wondering. I've got some mixed feelings, but I've heard some good stuff.
I would love, and I'm glad that you do, because for that, it increases my interest in what you would think about the book. So I would love to talk about that.
We'll do it. We'll do it. There's three of us.
Michael Shermer's The Moral Arc. Michael Shermer is the head of the Skeptic Society.
Okay.
And that's a pretty big book, The Moral Arc, but it's pretty interesting, and kind of a similar themes between, the role of science and pulling us out of where we've were in the Dark Ages. I had another. This book is just kind of, I don't know how much it like altered my world, but there's a book called Eye of the Beholder by Laura Snyder that's about comparing the lives of Anthony von Leeuwenhoek, the guy that discovered, didn't discover the microscopy, but was the first person to see blood cells and sperm cells and things from his lenses that he created. She compares his life with the life of Jan Vermeer, the painter. They both lived in Delft at the same time. And Delft, apparently, in the Netherlands, is a place that's not much bigger than a few football fields. And these two guys were living at the same time, and they were both using lenses. They believe, people believe that Vermeer may have been using lenses to essentially make hand-created photographs. These paintings are really not photographs, but they're like that. That he's projecting an image and painting. And then Leeuwenhoek is using these lenses. As a photo teacher, I've been very obsessed with the idea of glass and lenses as like artificial intelligence and the ability to like push beyond what we know. The first sort of extension of our senses. So I'm really fascinated by books that touch on that. So that book, and then I would probably just say almost anything by Bill Bryson I've thoroughly enjoyed. too.
Yeah, that's funny. He is one of my top 5. Yep.
The Body I read this summer, and they're kind of, they're written in that way that they are what they are, or he's just kind of going through a particular thing, like, how your body works, or relating things to the rooms of your house and home. But those are all.
He does a good way to take complex information and make you understand it, but not only understand it, he creates a vision that you can relate to.
Yeah.
For all these things. Yeah, The Body, or the one of my top 5 is his short history of nearly everything. Have you read that?
Yeah, and I think the female counterpart to Bill Bryson would maybe be Mary Roach. Mary Roach, who wrote Stiff and Spook and all these ones that are delving into one topic. And we talked about Packing for Mars, although you didn't really particularly love that.
Did you like it?
Me?
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't like it as much as some of our others, but
I love Stiff.
Yeah.
I love Stiff, and there was another one I read about. Was it called Choke? No, or Gulp?
Spook.
Gulp.
Did you read Spook? Spook is really fascinating.
No, have you read any, Jake, of her?
No, but I'm loving these title names. They're very catchy.
She's phenomenal, and I love it. And Steve and I were going to do Mary Roach's book, Packing for Mars, and like you said, Steve, really interesting, and I like her. But I didn't find it enough to dive into a lot. So
it's a little bit like a Bill Bryson kind of book. It's just here's everything that went into getting to Mars, and here's some weird things you don't know about how they have to go to the bathroom in space, and it's pretty fun. And just
I think one of the things that the one thing she mentioned so much is the typical astronaut is not what we think they need. They don't need all this other crazy things like, power, we think of machismo, right? And she's like, no, mainly you got to be able to just suffer and put up with BS and be bored and do, those are the things you really need. So yeah, and thank you. Because the reason I asked for your top 5 is both of you had books some of them I've never heard of. Never read most of them, so definitely I want to read those. Mine were Sapiens.
That's good too.
Just that book. Still, I've read it twice. I'll probably read it again. Steve, you've talked about this book before, but Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Jared Diamond, that's a good one.
Yeah, changed everything in the way that I view the world.
That's a good one.
Yeah, the way that just the whole world functions and how it developed, why this area developed more than that area. And it really goes how the modern world's created from early on. And a lot of it just has to do with geography. The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, which was written by probably my favorite fiction author, Jose Saramago. Have any of you read Jose Saramago?
You lent me one of his books years ago. It was very good. I don't recall which one it was, but it wasn't that one.
Yeah, he is. I'll tell you, he won the Nobel Prize, I think, in '98. And his sarcasm about everything. He's from Portugal. I think he got expelled from Portugal. I think he had to move to like an island because he said so much against the Catholic Church. But his book, The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, is probably one of my top books ever. Just because he takes it from Jesus's perspective. And it's just phenomenal. A Brief History of Nearly Everything, or A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. Again, just because of the way he talks about an atom, the way he talks about electrons, the way he talks about, I think one of my things that stands out to me most is he said that if the Earth was a pea, he talked about, solar systems, and we all look at these things in our books, or people make models of the solar system. The real dimensions would be if the Earth was the size of a pea, then Pluto would be the size of a bacterium 2 miles away. And those are the things that just blow your mind, just amazing. And he makes you realize that, wow, that's how big the solar system is. And he said, just to be able to detect that, imagine something on the side, on the pea, and to be able to find a bacterium 2 miles away. Jennifer
Yeah.
just commented this is
Yeah.
not about Caste. Right,
A little
Jen,
bit off
you're
topic,
right.
maybe.
Tuned in late. This is after hours, Teller.
Yeah, this is after hours talk. Sorry,
The
Jen.
Caste of bacterium.
Yep. And
I
then
got one more book I want to throw in, Mike.
what?
I got one more book that came to my mind that I
Good.
would like,
What is it?
because it's different than the other ones I said, which is it's been a long time since I read it. I mean, it was more like in graduate school, but Jack Miles, this Jesuit priest, wrote a book called God, a Biography. And that's a pretty fascinating book where he breaks down the Old Testament almost like as a literature professor, saying, what can you know about the protagonist? What can you know about God as a protagonist from these, I think it's first 5 books maybe, or something like that, of the Old Testament. That really was a fascinating
What is that called again?
God, a Biography by Jack Miles.
Okay, I'll check that out.
That is also was definitely a book that I was fascinated by.
Yeah, have you ever read, or have either of you heard of Zealot by Reza? I forget his last name.
Oh yeah, Aslan.
Yeah, Aslan.
Okay.
That's a good book too. That's a phenomenal book on the same type of lines. All right, fellas. Jen's calling us out.
We need an offline book club at like Rheingeist or something sometime soon.
Oh,
I'm game for
ready.
it. I got a recommendation for you, Steve, too, on Wonderland. Have you ever heard of that one? By Richardson?
Yes.
Steve Richardson? No?
I think I have it, but haven't read it. Tell me what it is.
What's that about?
It's about how like play is really the driver of all inventions in the world. So it's not been necessity or science that's really driven inventions, but rather just people using play and enjoy to create new things. So highly recommend kind of thinking about like glass and the extension of senses.
Yeah.
I think you'd appreciate that one.
It's called Wonderland.
Wonderland, yeah. How play made the world.
Okay, yeah, definitely. If I forget about that, bring it up at our Rheingeist meeting when that happens.
All right. Well, hey, Steve, I want to put you in charge of our Rheingeist meeting.
All right, man. All right.
The 3 of us, we're going to do the moral landscape.
You should.
Jake, you have to read it still. So we're going to say July, August.
It's a fascinating book. Let's do that. Seriously, I would love that.
All right. You guys are awesome. As always, thank you so much. And I'll see you in July or August.
Stay safe, guys.
That's good.
All right. Be good. Good night.
Have a good one.
See ya.